Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Just going to blow up this presentation. Okay, so just want to be mindful of time. We can go ahead and get started. I believe the session is being recorded, Sophia, so hopefully that's helpful. But welcome, everyone. Just wanted to put together this presentation around the waitlist process for MBA admissions. So the good thing about the waitlist process is that it's not a definitive, it's not a no, it's not a definitive no. So hopefully with some of the tips that I share today, you find ways to kind of bolster your candidacy and make a case. So really quickly, just a little bit about myself. So I graduated from Chicago Booth and Harvard Kennedy, got my MBA and my master in public policy at the same time. When I was applying to school way back in the day, I was admitted to five top MBAs with over $1 million in scholarship offerings. I'm incredibly grateful for that. Since graduating, have had tons of admissions experience with the Harvard Kennedy School, working with the admissions office there, and with IDV Advisors, which is a boutique consulting firm as well. Have worked with all kinds of people. Recently I helped someone get into his fourth master's program as a third-time reapplicant. That was a huge win. Just getting to demonstrate to the admissions committee, like, hey, this is really his passion. This is really what he wants to do. But another highlight is I helped a client get into, I think this was Sloan, with a 3.2 GPA, 145 and 158 GRE score, and they got 60% funding from Sloan, which was a great, a huge win. And just a little bit about myself. I'm a first-generation Latina. I'm based in San Francisco, and I currently work in impact investing. So really quickly, if you would like, it would be great to hear where you're dialing in from. We will have time at the end of at the end of the session for some Q&A. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and more than happy to get to know you that way. Okay, so about the MBA waitlist process. So the long and short of the waitlist process is that it's very dependent on school. Every school approaches it differently, and acceptance rates are kind of off the wait list or all across the board. So for example, in 2021, Wharton took just 3% of waitlisted applicants, whereas Kellogg accepted 35% of those on the wait list. So obviously a far higher share there. In general, though, only about a third, roughly 30% of waitlisted MBA applicants receive an offer for admission. The thing that makes the waitlist process tricky is that most candidates get no feedback or guidance from admissions. Oftentimes people just get put on the wait list and they say, no need to action anything, and folks are just left to wonder what it is that they could be doing better. So we'll definitely cover some of those elements here. One thing I do want to emphasize about the waitlist process, though, is that speed matters. In that at this point, like the wait list is about yield and about ensuring your target school that you will want to attend, that you will attend. And so part of that is showing speed, part of that is showing proactiveness. And we'll get to do that. We'll get to go through some elements of how to do that here in just a second. Okay, so much like the regular application process, I think it's always really helpful for prospective students to reflect on their original application and think about, what are some of the potential gaps that could be there, and how might I be able to bridge those gaps or address them. I will say I have worked with a fair share of candidates before who were like, my essays were wonderful. And then I read the essays and I'm like, actually, I really, strongly disagree. And this is why. So, take this self-assessment with a grain of salt. But for example, academics, we all know that your undergrad GPA, your GMAT or GRE scores, any academic awards, all of these are factored into assessing your academic readiness for a program. And some ways to potentially address any gaps here is, for example, if you didn't have the most stellar undergrad GPA, if there's a way to bolster your test scores, in the next few weeks and submit an updated score, or to take, a rigorous class at a select institution. People take one-off classes or even things like MBA math all the time to show that, hey, I'm really ready for the rigor of this process. Otherwise, academic endorsements, by prominent scholars can be really helpful. Like some people just are not great test takers, or some people's, academic abilities are not part of, are not reflected in their GPAs. So just showing that. On the career side, definitely if you've had any considerable updates to professional experience, whether it's a promotion that you can share, or submitting a major deliverable at work, oftentimes those application updates are received really favorably by admissions officers. And then also, if stepping back, you kind of get guidance or think about the maturity of your post MBA goals, and you're able to say, okay, you know what, I didn't actually really clearly articulate why this program would help me with my specific long-term career goals. If that comes to mind, that might be an opportunity for you to write in. The other component that admissions officers always look at is, leadership and diversity, your networks, any unique backgrounds and perspectives. Obviously, MBA applications are relatively short compared to other graduate school applications, and folks don't get as much of an opportunity to showcase the richness of their lived experience. And so if you feel that there's something you didn't share in the first go around that would enhance the class experience, given the unique background you bring, that might be worth mentioning. The number one thing to remember, though, about the wait list, and there's a reason this is underlined, is yield. And the wait list process is all about yield and whether the admissions committee believes that you will come, right? So they have to believe that if they let you in off the wait list, you will come. Admissions offices care deeply about their yield. Their yields impact their school rankings, and school rankings matter to these institutions. And so, have you demonstrated a genuine interest in attending? Have you visited the school? Have you had substantive conversations with the admissions committee, with current students, with alumni? Have alumni, written recommendations for you, saying like, hey, if you let this person in, they will come. So those are just some of like the primary things to consider, and we can talk about these more in depth in just a second. Okay, so we kind of talked about all the different variables factored into the waitlist process. And now the question is like, okay, what are the mechanics of, of showing, hey, I really want to get in off the wait list. So I would say that the first tool at your disposal is to write a compelling letter of continued interest. I will say, I know this varies by school. So for example, there's the HBS camp, which is very much about don't write in unless it's like something super substantive. Like we're not interested. That's fair, but for most other schools, like they really, unless they state explicitly that like writing in will not help, most other schools really will take into consideration these kinds of updates. So what we can do is we can just take instead of like 5 to 7 minutes, we can just take 1 or 2 minutes here. I'll give you some quiet time to think about, what you might want to include in a letter of continued interest, right? And so going back to this rubric of how your application materials are assessed and how you might be able to work around some limitations while you're on the wait list. If you just want to take a minute or two to jot down some ideas, I will pause for just a second, and we can continue on in just a little bit. Want to be mindful of time. So, feel free to continue reflecting on that after the session, but hopefully that was a good starting point. Okay, so we talked about letters of continued interest that you can write into the committee. Another strong tool at your disposal is obtaining additional endorsements or recommendations from people associated with the institution that you're targeting. So whether that's alum, whether it's people who have taught there before, whether it's people who currently work there in some capacity, you can get pretty scrappy in thinking about, how do I utilize a tool like LinkedIn or my current networks to get someone to vouch for me. Ideally, the people or the person who writes into the admissions committee will know your work firsthand, will have worked with you in a professional capacity. But sometimes we do not always have those luxuries. And so I can just tell you, like, there was this one time I was working with an applicant, and they were just randomly reaching out to like senior people on LinkedIn at this specific target school because they didn't know any alumni and they didn't have any people in their personal networks to lean on. And someone eventually picked up the phone, like a senior executive, and they were like, okay, I'm on the treadmill. You have 5 minutes to like make your case for me for why you want to go to this school. And that person, was able to convey their genuine interest in attending, and was able to get, an endorsement from this individual that eventually helped them. So, it's super, super important to just, get scrappy, think about who you might be able to reach out to. And I will say, like, obviously there's a bias here towards people who have strong professional or academic networks. But there are also people, who come from working class backgrounds, who have extended family members, who might work, in more of a staff or administrative capacity in one of these institutions. I wouldn't shy away from tapping into those opportunities either, because in this country, in the United States, we love to tell ourselves that we are really good about economic mobility. Whether that's the case or not is, up for discussion. But all that is to say is, like, there's that scrappiness is usually welcome. So again, here, I'll just pause for a minute, give folks an opportunity to think about who they might be, able to reach out to for an endorsement. And we can pick it up in just a second. And someone just asked, are endorsements encouraged before being waitlisted? I would say no. I've only seen them be effective if folks get waitlisted. I would say, if anything, it's a net neutral at best. So I don't know that I see the inherent value of those before a waitlist process arises. Unless Henry Kravis is writing in for you, then it might matter. For schools where they are both undergrad and MBA offerings, does an endorsement from an undergraduate help? Yeah, I think so. Obviously an MBA graduate's endorsement will carry more weight, but certainly any affiliation is helpful. Okay, let's move to the next thing. Another component is staying engaged with the program. So I know people are like, Karla, I live in Austin. I don't really want to schlep all the way up to Hanover to talk, but I really want to go, but my schedule is like so busy. And at the end of the day, like this is such a huge investment of time, energy, resources, right? That if you can't make it on campus or you can't find a way to stay engaged with a program, even if it's just a local event, um, that might raise some eyebrows. Obviously, there are so many situations, there are people who are immunocompromised, there are people who, obviously, so many international students, where that kind of travel is just truly off limits. And so, you know, in today's age, we are super lucky in that Zoom has been super normalized. It's a way to engage with folks. And again, whether it's having a follow-up conversation with your respective liaison at the admissions office, whether it's visiting the school, whether it's attending a webinar, and in your letter of continued interest, talking about, what you've learned from that experience. There are just so many ways to, stay engaged and to show that you really want to go. And so again, here, take like a minute or two to brainstorm ways that you could potentially stay engaged with the program. So someone asked if you visited a school before. Does it make a huge difference to visit again? I'm not sure how additive, an additional visit might be. Perhaps the first time, if you didn't get to meet folks in the admissions office, or if you didn't get to sit in on a class, perhaps that might be beneficial. But just showing up again to show up again, it may not be the best use of your time. Okay, so I want to make sure, what's it called? Want to make sure I leave time for more Q&A here. We can transition to that. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat. From your perspective, does connecting with student ambassadors help? Yes, absolutely. These people aren't going to make a final decision, but they have a say and they can lobby favorably for you. Could you talk about what to include in a letter of interest? It really depends on having that analysis of what your shortcomings in the application might have been. So it could be, if you're short on work experience, it could be saying, hey, listen, I got a promotion. If it's an update to test scores, if it's demonstrating interest in the schools, it could be a number of things. What's the optimal number of letters of recommendation to send? I mean, I wouldn't send like 15, right? You like there's no like magic number, but I think that letters of recommendation that are thoughtful, that are tailored to you, that make a case for why that specific school is the best program for you, those are always the best. How can I make the most of a campus visit? What topics should I touch on with the admissions members I meet? Again, we talked about yield and how that's priority number one. So that's what I would emphasize. And then in terms of like campus visit, just reaching out to different folks, having like an inclusive, having a having like a well-rounded visit and then being able to reflect on it is really important as you think about like your letter of continued interest and such. With speed being important, is there a general timeline you recommend people have their action items completed? So this will vary by school. I know some schools give you, a definitive timeline saying, hey, submit like any updates by this date. You should absolutely abide to those. But in general, like the sooner you can, make a case for yourself, the better. And the reason for that, again, is that like with round two, slots are filling up. And at that point, it's just kind of a numbers game. And the more you show interest, the higher you are in the queue, the more visible you are, the more of an opportunity you might have to make your case. Um, what's it called? So just a heads up, like if folks want to work on like a letter of continued interest together or thinking about like, hey, what actually happened with my application? I always partner with folks, so feel free to have a look at my profile. From time to time, I also share events and tips on LinkedIn. So I'll also drop my LinkedIn in the chat in case folks want to connect. I think we might have time for one final question.
Oh, can I take this?
Sure.
Yeah, so this is a question specifically for like being an untraditional applicant.
Mhm.
Reference, I'm a full-time influencer, so I make TikToks for a living. So that was definitely an uphill battle. In terms of being waitlisted, like when it comes to promotions and things like that, I don't necessarily have, the ability to say like, hey, I've been promoted. I don't even necessarily have like a manager who
Mhm.
gets to what I do. How would you recommend kind of going about, updating AdComs? Like I've been like, hey, like I closed this deal and like this thing is working out really well and like my podcast has reached this metric and so forth. But like, it's a little difficult coming from my end versus, being a consultant and saying like, hey, I just got promoted. So like, how would you recommend going about like updating in a meaningful way when like what I do is relatively niche?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a tough one, but I think you nailed it, right? Is just uh looking at specific metrics, whether it's revenue that you're bringing in via your pages, revenue growth, audience growth, partnerships, number of partnerships growth, all of those things can show progression. And unfortunately, you're just kind of in a different position. But like social media is so big in our world today, and there is like a real argument to be made that like your classmates would benefit from your knowledge in that area, right? Because social media isn't going away anytime soon. That monetization channel is only going to keep growing. And so if anything, you could like turn that non-traditional background into a strength potentially. Just want to take this last question in the chat. Do you have any thoughts on how to best work with specific schools? Uh, every, can't run into like, can't run through every single program. But again, I would just abide by the parameters that they give you. Some schools, will give you a wait list email to send specific updates to. Other schools will ask for, for updates as you have them. If you continue being interested, I would absolutely, continue making those updates and sharing those out. Okay, so I think we're at time. Thank you everyone for joining. Again, I dropped my LinkedIn. You have my Leland profile. If anything comes up, feel free to shout. But hang in there and best of luck with the admissions process.